Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Susan Valakis, and I'm the Training Development Coordinator at Now, and as such, I bring you these webinars on the third Thursday of each month. If you've missed any of them, you can find replays on our website, nowfoods.com/webinars, or on our Now YouTube channel. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please use the chat bubble on your screen to submit your questions, and we will respond directly to you with an answer by email. Today's presentation, The Role of myHMB in Human Nutrition, will run about 40 minutes, but it will not disappoint as we welcome Shawn Baier, Chief Operating Officer for MTI Biotech and Vice President of Business Development for the Innovative Products Division of the TSI Group. Mr. Baier holds a Master's of Science degree from Iowa State University and his MBA from the University of Iowa. He has a long history with the ingredient that we are discussing today, HMB, and I'm going to let Shawn tell you what HMB stands for because I have difficulty pronouncing it, so please be sure to listen for that. Mr. Baier began with MTI Biotech as a research scientist in 1997, overseeing outside research projects related to HMB and muscle performance and health, as well as marketing and sales of HMB to the sports nutrition and adult nutrition markets. He later accepted a position at Iowa State University's Center for Designing Foods, where he was responsible for managing all research projects at the center. And one project in particular, Shawn worked on a year-long NIH-NIA-funded research study investigating the benefits of an HMB-containing nutritional supplement on muscle mass and function in older adults. And then in 2007, Mr. Baier returned to MTI Biotech as Director of Sales and Marketing, and in 2008, Chief Operating Officer. Today, Mr. Baier is Vice President of Business Development for the Innovative Products Division, where he focuses on new business development, research and development management, as well as identifying and acquiring new technologies for commercialization. So with that impressive career, he is certainly well equipped to speak to us on the role of myHMB in human nutrition. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Shawn Baier. Welcome, Shawn.
Thank you, Sue. I truly appreciate the opportunity today to speak to you and the entire team on this call. And with that, we'll start off talking about myHMB, healthy muscles, healthy life, the role of myHMB in human nutrition. Now, we will cover several different categories of HMB in specific consumer groups, but just really kind of hitting the high point here as a brief overview. We'd like to refer to HMB as one of the most effective nutritional solutions to increase, preserve, and support healthy muscle function. HMB, or it's an initialism for beta-hydroxy beta-methylbutyrate. It is the active metabolite of leucine, which is one of the branched chain amino acids that we know, and it's an essential amino acid, leucine. Part of protein complex is where we get leucine. So we really look at HMB as this kind of downstream metabolite of what we ingest and what our body can process from leucine. And as we kind of go through these slides, I'll kind of explain the process, the mechanisms of action, and as I said, the various consumer groups that it impacts. But we really want to point out just these kind of top level concepts of what HMB can do. There's data that you'll soon see that improves muscle size and strength, improves body composition in the consumer, improves function and quality of life. And a category we won't go into much discussion about today, but it does have many applications in more of a clinical setting for things like mobility and recovery. HMB is known to regulate muscle in healthy individuals. There's data in diseased populations as well, young and old, male and female. There's over 50 human studies. There's actually, if you look at the total depth and breadth of data, there's well over 500 studies on HMB, from animal nutrition, clinical nutrition, safety studies, toxicity studies, and even in vitro models. So with that, there's a considerable amount of depth and breadth to the data set that we'll go over today, but we'll keep it to the very top line, critical, I would refer to as the seminal studies relating to the various claims that we can make around HMB. As it points out, there's been numerous reviews as well as meta-analyses published in peer-reviewed publications. So let's talk briefly about that mechanism of action. What makes HMB actually relatively unique is that it stimulates both protein synthesis as well as reduces protein breakdown. So it's this dual mechanism of action that you get with HMB, and that makes it kind of more unique in the aspect of what we see with something as simple as protein ingestion or overconsumption of calories, or specifically consumption of leucine. You see improvements in protein synthesis. But what we don't typically see with that type of method of increasing protein synthesis is the accompanying reduction in protein breakdown. So we know muscle is a dynamic tissue. It's continually being broken down and rebuilt. And as we point out here, that's at a rate of about 1% to 2% per day. Now, with that, if there's small changes we can make to maintain or reduce some of the breakdown, at the same time increasing protein synthesis, the net gain will be an actual improvement in whether it be the muscle mass, strength, and or function. So basically the supplementation that we recommend is 3 grams for optimal results per day. Now, with that, we also point out that, and you'll see shortly here in the study, that 1.5 grams of HMB can be used, and we do have data that supports that for increasing strength and muscle mass. However, the depth and breadth of the data I just referred to is on the 3-gram dose. In terms of kind of the relevance of how it relates back to protein, as I mentioned before, protein contains leucine. Leucine is metabolized down to HMB. So many times we get questions of, can I just consume more protein, or can I just take more leucine? And then to put that into context, it would take about 600 grams of high quality protein containing leucine to actually get something equivalent to 3 grams of HMB through natural metabolism. Or another way of looking at it is 60 grams of leucine per day. So that's really not feasible or quite available to most people. But let's put it in more context. There's another assumption that's made there, is that we can force that pathway. And unfortunately, there's probably feedback inhibition that prevents that 600 grams with, say, 60 grams of leucine converting over directly to 3 grams of HMB each day. So the easiest way to do it, and that's why we have dietary supplements, is to supplement the diet. Now, I want to briefly just talk about kind of lifespan, if you will, relative to muscle mass and muscle function, or reserve, if you will. HMB is important across all stages of life. It's something we really like to point out. Now, I'll put the caveat on there that we're not talking about early life and early child development growth. So really starting at time point A here. But what we do in our 20s and even early 30s, really that adult life, really sets the stage for what we have for our reserve. Now, at any point along this line, you see on this white line and orange line, this is what we typically see with aging. Now, this isn't some type of disease state or condition. This is just the natural process of aging. In normal, healthy adults, we see an inevitable age-related decline in muscle mass and muscle function. So backing that up to, well, how can we impact that? For the most part, we look at trying to maintain muscle through proper nutrition and through exercise. So here comes, the element of what can HMB do here. We really want to think about the benefit it can give as just as it is. It's a dietary supplement. We're trying to add on not just what we are consuming, but also the benefits we're getting from the activity and exercise we do. So with that, let's look at some of these consumer-centric kind of health positioning that we have with HMB. So first off, we'll touch on the research and the support we have for the traditional sports nutrition or performance-driven consumer. These individuals are those people that like to either perform or compete against others or against themselves. So we think of strength athletes, bodybuilders, fitness enthusiasts, competitive athletes that are more on a traditional, whether it be a gym floor, a field, a pitch, whatever it might be, that there is their outlet. It's truly set with performance-based goals. And that's where you typically see the bodybuilding, the strength athlete, and the traditional sport nutrition bodybuilding market. From there, we have a consumer group we refer to as active nutrition or body composition. These are individuals that truly are still focused on the performance benefits of an active lifestyle, but also looking at it from a health perspective and a body composition perspective. And then last and certainly not least is healthy aging. We typically think of healthy aging and we look at the very far end of the spectrum, but healthy aging starts as young as 30, 35. It's what we do now that sets the stage for our future. So if we can do things not only from a nutritional standpoint and activity standpoint, but also from a dietary supplement standpoint, we can show that HMB can play a significant role across all three consumer groups. So let's look specifically at the performance-driven individual. And as I go over these various studies, I'll hit the high points, and you can see that all the claims and all of the benefits that we report here on HMB are well supported by research. And these are just examples, as I said before, of the seminal works that are done on HMB relative to this specific claim or this specific consumer group. So with the performance-driven individual, we're really looking at ability to train harder, recover faster, and improve or get that additional edge on the competition or performance mindset that we have here. So with HMB, we see improvements in muscle mass and strength. We see improvements in work capacity or that ability to do more because of an improvement, as you see later, in recovery. We improve body composition. Not only do we see an improvement in the muscle mass, as noted before, but we also see this improvement in fat loss with HMB supplementation. And then we also have a very significant impact on muscle damage and soreness. When we reduce muscle damage and soreness, it allows us to recover faster, and ultimately we can train harder for greater results. So let's look at some of the early research, and this is the study I referenced about the 1.5 grams of HMB dose being efficacious, but not necessarily optimal. So in an early study, we looked at HMB with resistance training, and we observed it increase lean body mass in both the 1.5 gram and the 3 grams of HMB per day. We also saw improvements in total strength. Again, there's a greater improvement with the higher dose, but we still observed a significant improvement in both lean body mass as well as strength gains during this rather short period of time. And this is truly a program that was set to be progressive and aggressive in terms of trying to increase the stimulus for putting on muscle mass and strength. So on the next slide here, you'll see HMB also enhances muscle mass and strength gains with training in more of a kind of expanded demographic here. So not only in the previous study when we were looking at men, here we're looking at men and women, and the ages were broadened out from that college age to a little bit older, so age 20 to 40. And with that, this was focused on 3 grams of HMB per day or a placebo. This time it was for a 4-week training protocol. And we observed improvements in upper body strength gains with training above the placebo. And we also improved, there tended to be an improvement in fat-free mass and a decrease in fat mass compared to the placebo. So when we start looking at this later in future slides, you'll see that it's more than just a change in the percent body fat, which can be accomplished by simply putting on lean body mass, but also a reduction in body fat absolute, not necessarily just a percentage. Next, we're looking at a study that kind of takes it from the strength or bodybuilding kind of aspect, and we look directly at how HMB can impact work capacity or endurance performance. In 16 college students, 8 men, 8 women, roughly about 23 years of age, over a 5-week interval training, taking HMB at 3 grams per day, or obviously a placebo, they resulted in a 2-fold greater improvement in VO2 max with HMB supplementation compared to the improvement you see with placebo-based training. HMB also improved the respiratory compensation point, which actually does a very good job of reflecting that improvement in lactic acid buffering. So in other words, you can exercise with HMB during your training, you can exercise harder or perform at a higher intensity for a longer period of time. And ultimately that is the goal of an endurance performance athlete. Taking it a step further from more of the running platform now to trained cyclists, we see similar improvements in peak oxygen uptake, which is kind of that submaximal or not the VO2 max, but the VO2 peak perspective, and looking at it from a standpoint of how did HMB compare to leucine and a placebo here. So that was, as I mentioned before, many people will ask, well, how come I just can't take leucine? Well, if you're taking a comparable dose, you'll see that HMB clearly outperforms leucine compared to leucine and the placebo. And again, we see improvements in, again, that peak oxygen uptake by 4%, increased in VO2 max. And we also see this improvement in lactate threshold. So in other words, it's that ability to exercise at a higher level for a longer period of time. Next, let's look at some of the indicators of muscle damage and see what HMB can do. So again, we're staying with that more of the endurance type athlete with runners here. And I want to point out that when we typically measure something like CK or creatine phosphokinase, what we're looking at here is a muscle enzyme and its appearance in the blood. A muscle enzyme should not be at high levels in the blood, and when you typically see that, it's indicative of muscle damage. So we always have a little bit appearing because it's what we refer to as that background noise or that basal level, because the muscle's constant state of being broken down and rebuilt. So you do see it, but what's interesting is during intense training or intense performance or a single bout of activity that you're simply unexpected, we know that there's muscle damage. That's kind of why we get delayed onset muscle soreness or any type of soreness related to activity. But what's a marker we can use to measure this? And what we have used traditionally in the exercise physiology community is measures of these muscle enzymes, or this one in particular, CK. With improvement or an increase, it's actually showing what I would refer to as higher damage. And when you see an improvement or a decrease in CK, you're showing a blunting or a protective effect on that muscle damage. So again, in this study with HMB or placebo for 6 weeks, and this is a running protocol, and then followed by a downhill run. Post-run, we see elevations in CK and LDH. But with HMB supplementation in the blue, we see a protective effect or a reduction in that muscle damage, thus resulting in kind of the improvement or a return back to baseline quicker. And when you can return back to baseline, you're more inclined to be able to exercise at that same intensity at a future date. So let's look at medicinal. Now, in even more significant improvement or difference from a placebo to the HMB group, you see in the initial start of a training program utilizing resistance training, individuals, these were 40 male subjects, again, college age, 19 to 23. They were on an HMB or a creatine and HMB or a placebo. Now with the HMB supplementation, we see an improvement. First of all, let's look at, just a quick note here. With this training, they also had an HMB and creatine gain in strength, but only HMB prevented the increase in creatine kinase or creatine phosphokinase with resistance exercise. So you see the placebo had a very significant increase in this muscle damage indicator, where HMB, again, the blue line, you see this protected or blunting effect. We also saw some indications of nitrogen sparing, which is also indicative of a less damage on the muscle. And then last but not least, as this slide kind of breaks out some additional context here. So looking at, these were in 6 untrained men, supplementation of HMB, and this was also with KIC, which is another metabolite of leucine. But you see this improvement in CK that's very consistent. You see improvements in the kind of rate of return back to your 1 RM after an exercise-induced damage bout. So you see in the bottom left-hand corner here, we see this typical decrease in 1 RM immediately following intense exercise-induced muscle damage. And then with HMB supplementation, you saw a quicker return back to that pre-level, where even at 72 hours, the placebo was still out. And then we also observed, although it doesn't appear to be the magnitude that you would think, there's a significant difference in delayed onset muscle soreness with HMB supplementation, thus improving strength and improving the ability to go back to the training protocol or the next exercise bout sooner. This slide represents the most recent ISSN, International Society of Sports Nutrition, position stand on HMB. And I just want to hit some key points here. I do know because of what's going on in the scientific community, there's a revised ISSN coming out in the next probably, I would say still in 2023, hopefully not going into 2024, but it's similar conclusions, just more updated information. But with that, the current ISSN position on HMB is one, HMB enhances recovery by attenuating that exercise-induced muscle damage we just discussed. We see athletes will benefit with consuming HMB in close proximity to their workout. HMB is most affected when consumed for 2 weeks prior to exercise. And I want to put context in that is to see the greatest results, it's important to get HMB in the blood and take it consistently. And once you've taken it for about 2 weeks, you start to see these repeated benefits occur with consistent consumption. Number 4, we see HMB enhance muscle mass or the hypertrophy. We see improvements in strength and power when combined with the appropriate exercise intensity. We know that HMB can improve lean body mass and functionality in the elderly and sedentary populations, which we'll talk about briefly soon. And then combining HMB with exercise may result in greater declines in fat mass, which we'll be discussing next. And as I noted, the mechanism of action is twofold, increasing protein synthesis while at the same time reducing protein breakdown. And most importantly, as we always want to point out, is HMB has been shown to be safe in both young and old, male and female populations. So there's a level of safety and efficacy that HMB brings to the consumer. So next we'll talk about kind of the active nutrition element and most importantly, the body composition improvements that we see with HMB. So we know HMB enhances body composition through not only increasing muscle mass, but what we're going to focus on here are more of the benefits related to fat, the actual fat loss or fat reduction. We see in intermittent fasting, HMB enhances body composition responses to that type of diet or calorie restriction. We see increases in fat loss with calorie restrictions in athletes. We see improvements in body composition in overweight women. And we also see from a mechanistic standpoint, improvements in fat metabolism, not just in muscle cells, but also in fat cells, which we'll show. So relative to intermittent fasting, in a relatively recent study, there were 24 active women, age 18 to 30, and it was an 8-week-long study. They did what I would call a very moderate form of resistance exercise, 3 days per week, just to have a consistency across all subjects. And the subjects were categorized into a control diet, which is the typical Western diet in timing. So it's, upon waking and until you return back to bed, you're allowed to eat your normal diet. And the time restricted feeding, it's basically a window, same as the intermittent fasting concept, from noon to 8 p.m. and they were given a placebo. And then for those individuals that were on the time restricted feeding, they were split out into obviously a placebo group, like I just mentioned, and an HMB supplemented group. So we have 3 arms: the controlled diet without HMB, we have the time restricted feeding without HMB, and then we have the time restricted feeding with HMB. And what we observed, and again, I want to point out that they were doing a moderate exercise intensity, resistance exercise, but only the time restricted feeding and HMB group had a significant decrease in fat mass and then the resulting improvement in body fat percentage. So let's look at how that breaks out. So we see the control diet, unfortunately, you would think a control diet they would maintain, but actually, as we know, many people on a typical Western diet, they gained a little bit of body mass over the 8-week time period. Unfortunately, as you see in the next set of columns, fat mass improved significantly for the control diet. But interestingly, the time restricted feeding resulted in a reduction in fat mass and to a greater extent with HMB supplementation. And then we look at fat-free mass, we see because of the resistance exercise that was added, we see all 3 groups improved lean muscle mass or fat-free mass. Only the HMB group improved at a greater numerical amount than the other two groups. But ultimately, how does that result? So when you have an increase in a greater amount of fat-free mass or muscle mass, and you have a greater reduction in fat mass, overall body percentage will increase significantly. So this is where we really look at it as HMB is more than just a muscle product. It is also has an impact on our fat, if you will, and our body overall body composition. So let's look a little more at other studies that have shown this similar benefit. Now I want to set the stage on this. This was not done by our group, but it's an observation that was done in female judo athletes. The reason why I say it wasn't done by our group is that this is done in the format of a traditional cutting approach to make a body weight for a competition. Clearly, from a research standpoint, it's not something that we encourage individuals to do in this type of aggressive cutting or weight loss to make a weight class for a competitive sport. But these individuals were female judo athletes, and they were cutting weight to make weight for a competition. But why we're using this data is because it is published, and it does point to the very severe amount of weight loss, how it can impact muscle performance. So if we look at, let's just start with the placebo, this black bar in the middle. Ironically, when we really cut weight fast, as many as us know, most of the weight loss does not come from body fat, it comes from water and unfortunately muscle mass as well. We see there's no change during this cutting phase in the placebo group relative to body fat. We see a 1.4% decrease in muscle mass. And that results in almost, well, over a 10% reduction in power, almost a 4% loss in grip strength, and a 5% in shuttle run, which is indicative of a physical performance test. Now, let's look at HMB. HMB actually resulted in a 5% loss in body fat, relative to the placebo, a greater retention of the muscle mass, although a small loss, it's still greater retention. As you see, it's almost a 1% difference in maintenance of muscle relative to the placebo with HMB supplementation. You see almost a 50% reduction in the loss of power that you observe in a placebo group during this cutting phase. And you actually see an improvement in grip strength relative to the placebo loss. And ultimately, we are able to maintain some of the performance from the shuttle run. So we know that HMB in this kind of extreme situation can enhance fat loss. And basically it does it by helping retain the muscle mass. If we retain muscle mass, we have to have, in essence, the fuel need that our body has to come from something, and that is utilizing fat stores. Maintenance of muscle mass and performance tended to be better in the HMB group, was the final conclusion. Next, and this isn't even a more recent study, this was just done in the past 18 months and published, we see a decrease in intramuscular adipose tissue, or IMAT, independent of exercise with HMB supplementation. And let's really talk briefly about what intramuscular adipose tissue, or IMAT, is. When we think about, and this might be kind of a uncomfortable visual to paint, but if we think of our muscles as a steak at a grocery store, and you look at it and you can see large amounts of fat between those muscle fibers, or you can see very little. Ideally, we want less fat integrated into the muscle in between those muscle fibers. And that's what we refer to as intramuscular adipose tissue. And when we start looking deeper at what that can cause down the road, is we see all kinds of metabolic issues with the higher amount of fat that's stored inside or between those muscle fibers. So looking at, these are in middle-aged women, age 45 to 60. We looked at approximately 40 healthy women. This was a 12-week long study with 3 grams of HMB as well as vitamin D or a placebo. They were randomized to an exercise protocol or maintain a sedentary behavior. And what we really just want to point out is that in both of these groups, we saw, in essence, an improvement in this intramuscular adipose tissue, which means a reduction in stored fat between those muscle fibers. We also observed increases in leg muscle mass in the sedentary subjects. In other words, without exercise, HMB is able to help an individual maintain and increase muscle mass, especially as we age, and you'll see that soon. So really want to understand quickly that mechanism in fat cells, and muscle cells relative to fat metabolism. So we already stated that HMB increases protein synthesis and reduces protein breakdown in muscle cells, but it also increases fat metabolism inside the muscle cell as well as in fat breakdown in fat cells. So let's kind of walk through this really quick. So within adipocytes or fat cells, we have a process of breakdown, and that breakdown is called lipolysis, and that frees up the stored fat or fatty acids and puts them through the bloodstream for our body to take them up and use them as energy. Our muscles, within muscle, you have obviously many different pathways of energy metabolism, taking, basically amino acids, using them for their carbon backbone, and utilizing that as an energy from, like in essence, glucose or gluconeogenesis, and ultimately becomes glucose. You actually have glucose, or the carbohydrate store, if you will, of glycogen. And then obviously you have fat utilization. All three macronutrients are also the same fuel sources, if you will, inside of our body. So when we look at fatty acid oxidation, when the glucose or the energy metabolism has shifted away from glucose and it moves to fatty acid oxidation, if it's available, the body will use that. So in this case, we see this improvement in fatty acid oxidation from HMB. And that will be kind of the next quick overview we look at. So in fat metabolism in fat cells, these are in cell culture work. So this is studies that are done in a controlled environment on the specific cell type. So with HMB in the medium, we see improvements as the concentration is increased. We see improvements in lipolysis, and that's also shown in gene expression. We see improvements in lipolysis as well as oxidative metabolism with HMB presence. And then in the muscle cells, here the same type of situation where we're taking specified cell types, which are muscle cell, and we're putting them in a cell culture medium. And as the higher the concentration of HMB is brought up, we see this continuing elevation to a plateau of in essence, beta oxidation percentage. So in other words, HMB is improving the muscle's ability to oxidate or use fatty acids. And then obviously in the second frame on the right here, the second figure, the element isn't the concentration, it's the time or number of days. So the longer HMB is present, the greater the improvement. So that goes back to that consistency of taking it and taking it for a long duration to have the overall benefit. Next, we're talking about healthy aging. And again, we'll overview each one of these, but we know that HMB has an improvement in physical function, even without exercise in an older adult. We see improvements in muscle strength and quality. We see increases in lean muscle mass. Again, we see additional data to support the relative loss of fat, improved body composition with exercise, with HMB. And we see improvements in functional mobility or that kind of free living or quality of life assessments that are often seen in older adults to assess improvements, whether it be from exercise or some other intervention. So we'll briefly cover some of these key studies. One of the first real big improvements that was observed with HMB supplementation came with a combination of HMB at 2 grams per day and then some additional amino acids to ensure that the older adult is having a quality amino acid profile in their diet. Looking at elderly women, the age was 62 to 85 years of age, averaged about 72. And what was observed was an improvement in hand grip strength. We also observed increases in knee extensor and knee flexor strength by approximately 15%. Now, I want to emphasize this is in only 12 weeks, and these are in non-exercising individuals. And then one might ask, well, would this be applicable to younger adults? You have to remember that in older adults, we see this inevitable decline in muscle mass and function. So the stimulus is actually the typical, normal, healthy process of aging, causing an impact on a reduction in protein synthesis and an increase in protein breakdown. So HMB is doing, through its mechanism of action, reversing the decrease in protein synthesis to make a greater increase in protein synthesis and kind of turning down that protein breakdown effect. So the stimulus for the older adult is the natural process of aging, whereas in the young adult, you need something like an exercise intervention, an intense resistance training or endurance, aerobic, anaerobic, high interval intensity training protocol to elicit that same change. And another study looking at the time course on more of what we can look at that functional or that mobility assessment. A typical test that is done is a get up and go test. In this test, the individual sits in a chair, they get up, they walk 3 meters, they turn around and they return back to the chair and sit down. What might seem like such a trivial, easy task for us to perform, when we get into our later years, especially as we get over that, 75, 80, 85, even in our 90s, this task clearly starts to be reduced. Our gait shifts, our strength, our confidence, our balance, going back to that definition of what we look at in terms of more of a frail older adult, as that begins to set in, we know that there's a much, much more challenging task to get up and do the get up and go test. And with HMB supplementation, again, it was with this amino acid combination as well, we saw a significant improvement in the get up and go test, taking it from an average of 10.5 or roughly 10 seconds to the improved just under 8 seconds in those that were taking HMB. And you see they started at roughly the exact same spot as the placebo group. So again, that just shows you that this intervention with HMB and these amino acids can improve that functional component of our muscle, even at older age. And again, without exercise. So taking this a step further, we, through the NIH, had funding for, is actually the NIH, National Institute of Health, and the National Institute of Aging, NIA. We received funding for a year-long study looking at changes in fat-free mass. And again, this is in this combination of HMB with these other amino acids. Now, as you'll see in a later slide, we truly believe the HMB is the active here, and the arginine lysine is just there as kind of an insurance to make sure that we have the proper amino acids present in the diet in these older adults. Because we know protein consumption can be a bit of a challenge in older adults based off of diet selection and absorption. So from a standpoint of, this is one of those scientific moments where we observed an effect with HMB versus a placebo of an increase in fat-free mass. But what we did observe in all of the HMB subjects was a concurrent increase in muscle function, or think of it as like the get up and go test, the hand grip strength test, or regular traditional strength measures were not observed in this group, in a small subset of the HMB group. But I want to emphasize this is a non-exercise. These individuals that were supplemented HMB did see a significant increase in fat-free mass. We also did some measures of whole body protein turnover, and we see an increase in protein kind of turnover, if you will, within muscle with HMB supplementation. Very indicative of what we were talking about of our mechanism of increasing muscle protein synthesis while reducing protein breakdown. And the reason why earlier I brought up about the subset of HMB subjects that did not show a concurrent increase in function, it ended up being directly related to vitamin D supplementation or vitamin D status. What we found in a retrospective analysis is that vitamin D levels, when they are not sufficient, and I'll refer to that as not being deficiency, but more of that sufficiency. So when we look at our serum 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels, we really drew a line of sufficiency at 30 nanograms per mil. This is very much supported in the literature. And it's, we talk about deficiency, we're talking about things like rickets, and that happens down in the single digit numbers, even the low teens for nanograms per mil of 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels. So we're talking about a sufficiency or a higher amount here. And when our levels are that high, what was interesting is that we actually observed, as you can see here in the figure, those individuals, although again, the HMB group increased muscle mass across all HMB supplemented individuals, when their vitamin D status was sufficient, we see that improvement in function. And this is something we're seeing more and more in the literature about vitamin D in general, is that it's not just for bone health. We see so many applications in other cell function. So having that vitamin D status sufficient is critically important for all cell function, but in this case, it ended up being critically important to muscle function and strength relative to the gain in mass. So after we received and performed these various retrospective analysis, we went back and did an HMB study, just ensuring that the vitamin D status is sufficient at this 30 nanograms per mil of 25 hydroxy vitamin D levels. And with that, this was another NIA funded study. It was a 12-month study, so a year long. And again, this is just HMB, so we didn't combine it with that amino acid combination as well. And with the addition of vitamin D status, again, making sure that they're sufficient, and that was through additional supplementation to ensure that, we observed even without exercise, HMB clearly improved, as you can see, compared to the placebo in figure, this is AA, but the one on the left, A on the left side, the functional index, in other words, muscle function, improved significantly over the 12-month time period. As a matter of fact, it increased at 3 to 6 months significantly and then was maintained. Going back to that initial slide we showed, or one of the initial slides where we see that lifespan of muscle reserve, this would be pushing that line back up to that white optimal line. And then obviously looking at more of a direct measure of muscle function is strength. As you can see at 3 months, we see a very quick return of muscle strength and then a maintenance, whereas the placebo group continued to vary with very little change, and actually from 0 to 12, there was no change in muscle strength. So with that, we drew a very significant conclusion here, is that HMB, as long as vitamin D status is sufficient, we see improvements in non-exercising individuals on muscle function and strength. So last, and certainly not least, I want to leave you with, why myHMB. Really, it comes down to the importance of supplementing HMB versus the assumption that we can simply just consume more protein or consume more leucine. HMB is truly that dietary supplement that allows us to supplement our diet so that when we consume protein, we're getting the most out of that consumption. And then more importantly, when some of our proteins aren't of the highest quality, like some of the plant-based proteins don't contain as much leucine, HMB has been shown to perform, or have the plant-based proteins perform much like whey when HMB is present with plant-based proteins. So again, it goes back to, rather than trying to consume a almost impossible amount of protein daily or an excessive amount of just leucine, let's just simply supplement our diet with 3 grams of HMB per day. And that can be performed obviously through the great products that we see available through Now Foods and the combination of HMB with other nutrients.
Wow, that was excellent information, Shawn. Thank you so much. And I appreciated your illustrations to really take a complex subject and kind of help us to really see the value. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I truly do. So you're very welcome, and truly, I thank you for the time and the ability to speak to your team.
Yeah, and it's always interesting for me, to hear these things, because I didn't really know anything about HMB. So, and I'm entering that older population now. And I would have to say that now that I am entering that older population, the only thing that's really good about it is the wisdom we get. So, so you are absolutely right on with, just doing what you can, to get going. And if we can see some benefit from the HMB, that's going to be that added encouragement for us to keep on going.
Sure. And
So,
that's really what we see as the benefit of HMB is, it is getting the most out of your session, whether you're a 22-year-old bodybuilder, a 30-year-old endurance athlete, if you are a 60-year-old woman who has experienced muscle loss. I'm not saying it from a, clinical muscle loss definition, just experiencing what we talked about is the normal aging loss that occurs in our muscle. No matter what it is, taking HMB has been shown to improve that muscle physiology, that increase that protein synthesis while reducing protein breakdown. So if we have that benefit coming in from the HMB, we're really optimizing the activity, the effort we're putting in. And why wouldn't we want to optimize? If I'm going to put the time into exercise, I want the most out of it.
that's right.
So let's do some things here to improve that strength and see if we get back that feeling or that change that feeling of a loss.
Yeah, good point. Well, awesome information. Thank you once again. I really appreciate your time spending with us, and the information was just incredible. So I thank you, and I hope we can do this again sometime in the future.
Oh, I
So,
love that. Thank you very much.
all right. And thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next month. Take care.